There is a secret that most pro athletes, elite CEOs, and high performers all know. They all have a group of world-class coaches working for them to help them optimize their potential. At SuperAthlete Radio, our goal is to provide you with the caliber of world-class coaches and guests to help you unlock your potential, dominate your industry, and dominate your life. Let's get better today. Really excited to bring Dr. Jeremy Koenig on SuperAthlete Radio today. Jeremy brought the fire. In our first episode of 2024, he has a really interesting background as an athlete, and then also in terms of what he has done in the genomics field, in the past working with athletes and now working with the general population, and how we can use our genomics to optimize our biology, psychology, and health. And in this episode, we go knee deep in terms of these areas, what we can do to improve them, and also kind of where the future is headed of genomics. He absolutely killed it, and I know you guys are gonna really enjoy the episode. If you have not yet, hit the link and followed and or subscribed to us on our podcast platforms. Please do us a favor and do that. It is the easiest way to support us at SuperAthlete Radio, and it's totally free. Let's get into it. Let's get better today. Jeremy, welcome to SuperAthlete Radio. How are you today?
I'm great, Chase. Thank you for having me.
Really excited to have you on with our first show of 2024. Any big plans for you this year in terms of personally, professionally?
Wow. Well, first of all, huge honor to be the first guest of the year. Wow. Because you're like up in the 700s, I saw, right? Like, wow, here we go. So congrats on that to you. And here's to a big year. On my side of things, what we were talking about at the top of the call is, some of my previous adventures in the world of human performance DNA. And, I spent about 10 years there. And that's like after all of my, kind of call it recovering academic life, that is, going through the whole grad school and little stint as a professor there before I got called into industry. And it really combined my two passions, athletics and genetics. And I've got this 10 years of trailing data and insights that I'm now packaging into what I'm, affectionately and informally calling, let's say, the DNA of Human Performance lecture series. So that's something that, I'm committed to working on and getting out there so high performers can, let's say, get easy access to understanding their genome. So that's, I would say, my number one focus for this year.
Yeah, that sounds super interesting. I'd be super interested in something like that. And then how did you, going back to what you just said in terms of hopping into that space from academia, what interested you about genomics and athletic and human performance? And then what kind of inclined you to take the step?
Yeah, you know what? When I was, I had a bit of a, let's say troubled youth, where there's a period that I dropped out of school for a bit. And anyway, I joined boxing for the wrong reasons, but it brought me back, let's say, and got me on my kind of corrective path. And so I had to, redo all my courses that I didn't do well enough in. And one of those was, biology and genetics. And at the time, one of the projects was to genetically engineer this construct. Keep in mind, this is high school, and it's got to be like 30 years ago. Yeah, 25 years ago. And it was around the time that they, on the cover of Scientific America, there were these mice with ears on their back. So these genetically spliced mice with human ears.
Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah.
It was around the time that Holyfield or Mike Tyson bit off Holyfield's ear, right? So it was like really, it was just like, wow, like these cool things that I was working on overlapped. But, more than that, on a serious note, my mom got sick with multiple sclerosis, and that was a disease that, is it genetic? Is it environmental? We don't know. And so I took an interest in trying to decode that. But I always kept into sport. So even though I kind of hung up my boxing gloves because, boxing didn't go well with my genetics homework, I did take up track and field, and I was a walk-on and competed at a high level there for years. But that's really what it was. It was like there was no margin for error in something like the 60 meter or the 100 meter as a sprinter, right? And although I was studying genetics, conventional genetics, medical genetics, and genomics, if you will, I couldn't resist looking at it through the lens of human performance. And so despite, going through and finishing my PhD, postdoc at Cornell for a while, did some of the early pioneering work on the human microbiome and the human genome, how those things interlock, and was even a professor of nutrigenomics after that. I just had this call back to, human performance in industry. And that's when I started company I founded called Athletigen, where we did this research on, let's say tens of thousands of athletes. And so really got to look into the molecules of some of the highest performing humans on the planet and appreciate, the little nuances that make individuals themselves and which can be leveraged for human performance.
There's a ton there. So I have a background in martial arts and track as well. You said it in jest, but when you say you didn't have the genetics for boxing, were you saying that jokingly, or were there specific things potentially that we have in genes that have been proven maybe through your time at Athletigen that benefits combat sports, whether that's reaction time, fast twitch fibers, things like that?
Yeah. Well, I'll say it wasn't that my genetics didn't mix with martial arts. It was that my genetics homework didn't mix with sparring practice, because, even though it was controlled, I was working with guys twice my age, weight, and experience. And, even if you like head a soccer ball 10 times a day, that's enough, so, but to answer your question, certainly, having a martial artist leverage their genetics for developing a training program, I would say is huge and key. And, you think about the periodization plan and fight strategy, taking into consideration your opponent, taking into consideration your natural gifts physiologically, your vulnerabilities, et cetera. Well, I mean, we see great examples of this, like Mike Tyson, for example. I think he was challenged with lung capacity, right? So it was a good strategy for him to get that done early. That was obviously, a huge thanks to Customato, his fighting style, but there is also maybe in addition to his, where he might've been inept in terms of his longevity, serious speed power athlete. If I'm typing him, he definitely has a sports gene. He definitely looks at weights and just puts it on. There are genetic presets for that. And, but what I can speak to personally on the track and field side, and you can probably relate as well. My chosen discipline was sprinting as a 60-meter sprinter. And, that I got everything I need in terms of the sprint stuff, sprint genes and response to weight training, et cetera. Got this monster truck engine, but unfortunately it's on this Chevette chassis. So any injury you can think of a sprinter having, I've had it. And I had the 7 surgeries to prove it. Knowing that information up front, well, that's the future that we're living in now. Is we can effectively tell athletes where the quicksand is and move them into prehab instead of rehab.
And then let's go into the weeds a little bit. And let's use you as an example.
Sure.
What are some things that if you knew now, like when you say monster truck engine and I forgot the lighter chassis, what did you see in your genomics that showed that?
Yeah. So for folks listening, they probably heard of, David Epstein and the sports gene, and that book centers around the sprint gene as the starting point, because that was one of the, first more notable, more pronounced, more statistically supported indicators of, let's say, performance or performance predisposition in the sprinting events. Said another way is you very rarely would see a sprinter without the sprint gene. I think there was one sprint hurdler documented, Mexican sprint hurdler. But otherwise, across the board, everybody's got the sprint gene. Here's the other thing I'll say is the older you are, the less valuable the genetic insights are going to be. Because what they're going to become is they're going to become more confirmation. It's going to be like, oh yeah, I always knew that. Well, now I know the underlying root cause. So that's interesting. Having the information beforehand is where you're like, oh, okay, you adjust the rudder a few inches and next thing you know, 10 years later, you're miles ahead in the right direction. So the sprint gene was one that I had. And, the thing with that is sprint gene is like instant gratification. It's like I respond super quickly to sprint training. I went from being ranked 700th in the country in Canada. Keep it on, I was a walk-on in the 60 meters. Went ranked from being 700th to 7th in the period of 3 months. Just yeah, and yeah, everything was focused on speed, power. Everything was, I responded insanely fast to weightlifting, so I was under the squat rack and squatting 500 pounds, and but I was paying complete zero attention to ligaments and tendons. So I suffered things like hamstring tears and pec tears and labral tears, and I'm grateful for it because it made Kelly Starrett a great friend of mine as a result. But that's really the big one is this set of injury genes. It doesn't sound sexy, and it's not the thing that you want to necessarily be enamored with, like, oh well, as it relates to how I lay down collagen, there are specific markers that would suggest that I'm more vulnerable, and so those are specific variants associated with, let's say, altered collagen strength, and so therefore manifest in ligament injury risk, reduced flexibility. So yeah,
And then if because I'm guessing a number of coaches approached you when you were at Athletigen,
Mhm.
and then let's say one of their high-level track and field athletes had that, how would they change their approach?
That's really interesting. So what I feel like first say about that is, well, yeah, they did change their approach, um, and it generally had to do with training load, right? Training volume. And this actually ties into, let's say the next category of genes. So in addition to, like, let's say the structural integrity that we're talking about, injury vulnerability, we just kind of talked about, there's your physiology training response genes. Both of those things come back to minimum effective dose, right? Because as an athlete yourself, you're overreaching, you're challenging yourself, and you're flirting with injury, and that's how we grow, right? So for athletes, well, we all have different breaking points, and those who are vulnerable break earlier. So instead of 3 sprint workouts a week, maybe some of these more vulnerable athletes are reducing that to 2, and then once they get to a certain level, maybe they only need 1. But then there's a ton of fascial work that they're doing to complement the decrease in muscle tone and combating inflammation. There's a lot of eccentric strength loading that's done to target the tendons and the ligaments and the insertions, origins and insertions of those muscles. There's much more work on skill and technique and optimization of limb placement. Because that's really what we're talking about, is we're vulnerable to the missteps, right? And so we have to have less missteps if we're injury vulnerable. And an interesting point on that is, we looked at this, cohort of Altus athletes, a few hundred of them, and we look at the distribution or the prevalence of injury protection in that population. If you consider, they're high performance athletes, they're over the age of 25. By definition, they needed to survive the NCAA, right? And so there's a certain amount of blessing and thanks to our parents that we would say for that. So what I'm saying is those Olympic athletes, 75% of them had injury protection compared to less than 50% randomly in the average population. But the 25% that didn't have the injury protection, that was the strategy. It was more time on the massage tables proactively. It was eagle eye on training volume and commitment to technical mastery.
And then do you think it was a coincidence that 75% became Olympians that did not have this injury gene? Or do you think part of the reason they became Olympians is because they were able to train more?
Yeah, so they in a sense they won. Let's say the 75% that came through, they won the genetic lottery and were more likely to let's say survive NCAA training, because that's a whole rigorous thing. As an NCAA athlete, it's not just you in the individual events and the track sports; it's the team events, and it's really about the team. So a lot of individual athletes sacrifice themselves for that. And some with career-ending injuries. So think labral tears and hamstring pulls and meniscal issues. And when you're sprinting at top speed, there's any number of things that, or if they're off subtly, will drive us in the wrong direction. So yes, the 75% that got there, they've been blessed. But let's not just, 25% that got there, it's interesting. It's not to say that they can't win Olympic medals. In fact, we see an overrepresentation of the 25% in terms of winning the Olympic medals because they have become more diligent in terms of circumnavigating their vulnerability. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I know, all the benefit. So one of our doctors here at SuperAthlete is a mentor of mine named Dr. Michael Ripley, who specializes in massage therapy. And he was at LSU when they won 9 straight national championships, and massage and mobility was a huge piece of that. I'd like to bring it back really. I'd love to hear your expertise on kind of like high level genes turning on and off. Is that something that's relevant here? How do you kind of view epigenetics? And yeah, let's just start there. Just kind of really high level. I'd love to hear. Let's start with epigenetics. How do you view epigenetics, and how much of a thing is that? And then how can we potentially use that to improve our lives and performance?
Yeah. Let's see. So yeah, epigenetics is real. And just for the folks listening, it's maybe interesting to frame it appropriately, where you've got, when we talk about genetics, we tend to be talking about single genes. We tend to be talking about, vertical inheritance, so genes being passed to parents, et cetera. When we look at genomics, it's really more, how does the whole genome work in concert? How do genes interact? But then also, how are they turned on and off? And, that has a lot to do with how, so back up even further. In your genome, you've got 23 chromosome pairs. Let's say the epigenetics is the modification to the DNA molecule itself, but not the code, so that allows more of the molecule to be accessed for expression, right? And so depending on what you do in your environment, that's going to turn on and off different genes, right? And we know this to be true for working out. There are all kinds of positive gene expression results associated with physical training. There's a lot of negative, associations with things like, say, smoking. And a really great example of this is actually research that's been done previously on the Dutch hunger famine, where women who are pregnant and exposed to those atrocities of, tragedy of starvation and, wartime, they would have children who had an increased predisposition for obesity and a paranoid schizophrenia that would last 2 or 3 generations into the future. And that's all because of epigenetic modifications. So different gene pathways are expressed to basically allow the organism to adapt in real time, right? So, and that's really the tough thing, right? It's like you come out now into the environment as a baby, and you're expecting wartime and you're expecting famine, but then those things aren't true. It's like, oh, okay, there's like a biological preset that we need to overcome, right? It's like before I've even exercised any behavior, in theory, I'm benefiting from my parents' behavior, which is a huge paradigm shift if you follow any, Darwinian evolution, which is all about variation of the population. The environment selects and it's descent with modification, and acquired characteristics are not passed on. So it's like, hey, if you're an athlete, that doesn't mean your children will be athlete. And it's like, well, it turns out actually those, behaviorally, your kids are picking up on that. But also there's reason to believe that the epigenetic profiles are being, basically designed now for those to-be parents who are athletes.
And then, are you able to tell what are some of the environmental and or food factors and or other factors that determine whether or not genes are turning on and off, or behavioral?
Yeah. So one of the markers that's worth knowing, let's say, is if we think some of these nutritional markers. So I mean, I'm not a big fan of drilling genes down to like, if I could pick one, like this would be the one. But if you made me, right? Like I would say for the injury protection gene, you're looking at like say your COL5A gene as a well-supported indicator of injury. For your training response gene is like you got to know the actin-3 gene, that's your sprint gene. And then for the epigenetics, let's say, and like the nutritional downstream effects, you're looking at the MTHFR gene, which has a direct effect on folate metabolism and the methylation process, right? So if you want to have enhanced behavioral change as a result of the work that you're doing, you need, because methylation is one form of epigenetic modification, you need to have that machinery working. So me personally, I have, let's say, the deficient version of the MTHFR gene. And so what that means is I proactively put in S-adenosyl methionine as a supplement to help with that. Well, I mean, a couple of downstream issues, but generally all connected to the vitamin B energy production molecules, pathways, but also inflammatory pathways as well. So yeah, that's a really good first place to start for listeners to say, what version of this MTHFR gene did I inherit? Mm-hmm.
And then going back to your time at Athletigen, these first kind of couple years working there, was there anything that stood out to you of like, wow, this is really interesting about this specific athletic population, or maybe just something else within the field that you noticed that was really interesting and or surprising?
Well, we kind of tend to, it was going in the human performance realm. You're like, where are the X-Men, so to speak, right? In terms of like, these athletes are, they're on the podium. They're the best in the world. Yeah, okay. So like I mentioned, there's the injury predisposition, call it genetic gift. And, there are, a few, others that, let's say, have an overrepresentation of all of the performance genes. So like if you think about in terms of athletes, like classing them physiologically, right? So let's say, broad strokes, HPPC athlete, you've got your anaerobic athlete and you've got your, your endurance athlete. It was very rare to see somebody who's gifted in all of those, but you did see it from time to time. And then, perhaps surprisingly, there was a certain level of predictive power. That is, you could look at an athlete and say, okay, I know this athlete is a sprinter, but it wasn't ubiquitous. So what I mean is, I would see some, incredibly talented 1,500 meter athletes who, for all intents and purposes, had sprinter profiles. But not really knowing that they had this predisposition, they were leaving something on the table in terms of strategy. So, for example, if you've got a 1,500 meter sprinter who's got the sprint gene, it's like, okay, well, now that's going to inform my strategy to, instead of leading wire to wire, maybe sit and wait and kick, because I can bust out a 21 or 20 point second 200. And not all 1,500 meter runners can do that. So the thing that became fascinating to me was, and what made me think about this is when I looked at the multi-event athletes, so like decathletes. Decathletes don't win every single event and then therefore win the decathlon. It's they allocate their time strategically to say, okay, well, here's where my advantages are in the throws and the jumps. And the mid to long distance. So that's where I'm going to focus, and that's how I'm going to win. Whereas others might be, no, I'm speed, power, and anaerobic, and so I'm going to focus on sprint and middle distance, and that's how I'm going to win. So you just started to see this, very like high level, intelligent, strategic planning around how athletes allocate the most valuable resource they have, which is time. Because they're all trying to get a world leading performance, and so. Yeah, it really is like the overarching theme. I was like, wow, these athletes are all playing chess. It's not checkers. It's not no pain, no gain. And you got these great coaches that are thinking in terms of like 3-year plans, where the 4th year is, I mean, that's the gravy, that's the performance, the Olympic year. It's all for that year. And so actually seeing this beautiful harmonization of not just the athlete training plan, but how that connects into the genetics. What I saw is like, wow, we are just at the beginning of a new wave of, let's say, truly precision performance training. Mm-hmm.
And then outside of genomics, in all your time working with these world-class athletes and coaches, is there any specific attributes that stood out to you amongst the, I'll ask twofold here. So amongst the coaches that you saw, like Dan Paff and guys like that, is there anything that you saw that was kind of a common thing that you're like, okay, this is why this guy is as good as he is?
Yeah. Sorry, I just lost you there. Were you were saying what stood out? Was there any one genetic marker that stood out?
No. So actually, this question is outside of genetics.
Okay.
In terms of like you spend all these years working with these world-class athletes and coaches. First, I want to ask with the coaches, was there any sort of common attribute that you saw in terms of their expertise and who they were as people that was like, wow, okay, this is the reason why this guy's so good?
Yeah.
Is there anything that kind of stood out?
100%. What I would say is obviously Dan Paff blew me away when I first met him. I mean, for those that don't know him, he's been to 11 Olympic Games. He's coached, preeminent sprinters and jumpers of our time. And that was like actually one of the first times in my life I was starstruck when I got to meet Dan. And it was funny because he's just my most, understated, reserved, down to earth guy. And, he's the most collaborative person that you've ever met. And like that, where, human performance, it's like the stakes are high and folks might want to keep, the secrets secret, because it's like, hey, this is how I make high performance. Like, no, Dan was by far the opposite, open book, huge collaborator, and just willing to do the work. Right. So, we talked about, your LSU, doc on staff. Was it LSU? Is that what you? Yeah. So that's one of the things Dan recognized was, we don't have good massage. We don't have access to good massage. And but if we have good access to good massage, it's like, we don't have a mobile massage person with us who's traveling to competitions. So he went and learned how to be a massage therapist and provided that service to his athletes. Right. So so I would say it's collaboration and service. Like, unbelievable service is the attribute that would shine through for coaches. And, so the same, so as was true for Dan Paff, is also true for Stuart McMillan, who is now the CEO of Altiz. And just their ability to, foster knowledge sharing and education of other coaches. I think you're going to see a ripple effect, to that open knowledge and information sharing, that will know no limits. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Unbelievable service. And then again, second part of that question, outside of genomics, in terms of the athletes that you saw. So we know that genetics play a factor. That's part of the reason that they ended up where they did. But was there any attributes that you saw that was kind of common across them, whether that's discipline and or grit, persistence, anything that kind of stood out to you there?
Yeah. I would say the athletes who were successful, it was curiosity for the sake of persistence. You know what I mean? And not like frustration. The frustration was a telltale sign that the athlete was on their way out. Right. Because you're like, basically it's like, I'm not getting the result that I want. That's interesting. Why? Versus, oh my God, the wind blew the wrong way and I didn't make the qualifying time. And I used to run these times when I was in high school. Like, what's going on? So there's something to be said for that. Of course it's, the growth mindset, but it's also how you approach that, in terms of being a lifelong learner, in terms of, hey, I might have actually forgotten something that I know and I'm not above learning or relearning something from anybody, who is aligned in terms of the vision. So I think that's, curiosity is key for those athletes to stay in the game. Like you look at a guy like Tom Brady, for example, and you look at guys like, well, Tommy John, for example. Like you just see athletes that are presented with these obstacles, and they're like, okay, how do I get around this? How do I go through it? How do I overcome? Right? Who am I becoming? So there's some spiritual element to what is driving those athletes.
I think that's really good. I think that's something that's a reminder for all of us. And then I really like the who am I becoming? Mm-hmm. I mentioned we were talking beforehand, and I told you about these big aspirational sports goals that my two boys have.
Yeah.
And I'm behind them 100%, but my number one thing is who you are becoming. Exactly. It's like that's the vehicle more so than like what you accomplish. So like I give you an example, like yesterday we were doing a training session and he wasn't shooting his basketball. He wasn't shooting the ball very well. So he just wanted to cut it off early. And then I kind of gave that talk of like, it's not about the outcome here. Let's do what we said we were going to do. You wanted to do this, arduous, challenging training sessions. And so I think that's super valuable to focus on that rather than let the external come along with it. And then in terms of the next generation, how do you see this in like a positive light impacting the health of kids now and kind of next generation 5, 10, 15, 20 years in terms of genomics? How can this really help kids optimize their health? And then I'll ask a couple questions on athletic performance there, but let's start with just health.
Yeah, I think what we were speaking on at the top of the call was, I said 1 in 10 people are, either a carrier of or are manifesting some form of rare genetic disorder. And now we have access to our entire whole genome sequence, right? You can get different providers for like under $400, where this was like $4 billion to sequence the whole genome, like back in early 2000s, 2001, which is just absurd. It's the access to that information at a fraction of the cost. The economy of scale is insane. And then, if you talk to me like 5 years ago, or 10 years ago when I started Athletic, like we were so early, but now it's just so exciting because now we're ready, right? So the birth of AI. So before it was like, wow, there's all this data, but nobody to analyze it, nobody to understand it. And it's like, well, the use of responsible AI is going to get us to a real, intimate understanding of our biology as defined by DNA. And so I think that in terms of general health, the way of the future is not going to be this reactive healthcare system that we're in. Well, you're always going to need reactive healthcare. That's not to poo-poo on the healthcare system, because like there's going to be car accidents, there's going to be accidents. So we'll let the reactive healthcare stay reactive and emergency. But I think we're going to see an emergence of more, proactive health, proactive wellness, as defined by, your kind of DNA compass at the center, constantly informed and upgraded with the environmental circumstances that you expose yourself to. So, a case in point, for example, is I mentioned to you, my wife and I have a daughter. She's 3 months old. I was concerned about, a few issues in terms of the rare genetic disorder issue, because I know I'm a carrier for, at the very least, age-induced hearing loss, maybe congenital hearing loss. And so, hey, good news, that's not true. But then there are all these other, kind of developmental points that you can consider along the way. So in particular, once you get the major stuff out of the way, so like any congenital issue or inherited genetic issue, then there's also like, what would you say, medical allergies, so pharmacogenetics, so knowing that beforehand, before waiting for an interaction. And then you get into like more the wellness and preventative, let's say, and that's going to be more nutritionally. So, is my daughter allergic to lactose? Does she metabolize beta carotene to vitamin A well? Like her dad didn't. Her dad turned orange, when he ate carrots, right? So it's like, what about her vitamin D requirements? That's going to affect her immune system development. So there are all these things that we know about in theory, and I think that they're going to move into practice, and I think they're going to become, much more accessible. Especially when you've got, people with a human performance mindset who become parents, and such as yourself, and are now thinking about the next generation. And it's like, well, guess what? How did we start this call? It's like, well, if I knew then what I know now. And it's kind of like, that's our job as parents. It's like, well, we know that. And it's like, how do I get my child to listen? That's a whole other kettle of fish, they say. So they say, but I think in terms of the next generation, I see, our whole genome at the center and supported by the, semi-regular health checkups, the bloods, the wearable stuff, the doc check-ins, right? So it's like all of that information in the context of your DNA. And that is going to make for much more intimate conversation, because right now we're really talking about, okay, well, how do I fit on the bell curve in terms of my development? So for Brooke, we were worried about body weight. Then we were worried about bilirubin counts, right? And it's like, okay, but having all of that cause for concern in the context of your genetics and the appropriate population, I think you're just going to get to, be much more precise in our decision-making ability. And, the opposite may be, well, it's not that major, I don't care. It seems like too much, or I'm concerned about data privacy and security, which is a thing. But if you let it ride, I think what we see in terms of chronic disease, it's like death by 1,000 cuts, right? Like that's how chronic disease manifests. And I think the future is allowing the next generation to circumnavigate chronic disease and basically enhance performance longevity.
That's really exciting. And then in terms of, this is so much effort. For those listening to this, you've moved on now. You're head of business development for a company called Sequencing.
Yep.
Could you talk a little bit about what Sequencing does? And then could you follow that up with, what do you feel like are best practices for ourselves and then for our kids in terms of getting our genomics tested, and then also kind of protocols? Is it that much effort, or is it really, it's not too much in your opinion?
Oh, yeah. Well, compared to what it was, it's no, not at all. So now, you can go to, say, companies like sequencing.com, which, by the way, I should say that I work for them because, I believe in that vision mission. This is a company that, they own themselves. And so what that means is when they say you own your data, you own your data. That's like kind of the first step is, that's yours and it's privacy forever. It's never sold. It's like, for all intents and purposes, running it on your own local system, let's say, which is very different from, 23andMe, because the business model is based on selling data to make therapeutics. And that's fine. That's just a different business model and makes some people uncomfortable. So, but the first step is you can, order a DNA kit from an organization like sequencing.com, and that's whole genome sequencing. And I've said that a couple of times. What that means, basically, it's billions of markers compared to like 100,000, which you're getting from most other companies, or a few 100,000. So if you see, genomics, or you get your DNA for $99, it's like, yeah, because you're getting 0.1% of your genome. You get your whole genome, we're talking about 3 billion base pairs. And so what that means is you're going to get access to everything we know about your DNA now, and everything that we're going to learn, in the coming years. And you get updates every week. So for people who are like, let's say, tech savvy and do-it-yourselfers, biohackers, I strongly recommend checking out sequencing.com. And what once you get your DNA kit in the mail, you send it back in. It admittedly, it takes a little longer than I'd like. It's like 12 to 16 weeks. That's just where the industry is. That's only going to get better. Again, remember, it took like 10 years to sequence the first genome. So the fact that we're at 12 to 16 weeks is good. Then once you get your data back, you can basically Google your genome if you know what you're doing. We have software that allows you to like hone in on specific markers if you know beforehand what you want. But if you don't, there's a whole app marketplace of um, of DNA reports. So there's DNA reports on cognition, and there's DNA reports on wellness and longevity and athletics performance. And so you can really spend a ton of time in there getting to know yourself. And then for folks who want more of kind of a bespoke service, because as you know, if you're ever going to do anything seriously, you get a coach who's expert in the area. For anybody that wants to go deeper, that's one of the things that I do, more focused on, a select few athletes that I work with and entrepreneurs, where effectively I start to harmonize that human biology with, psychology and performance periodization as it relates to the entrepreneur's vision. So I'm not as so focused working with athletes in as much as I'm focused more working with entrepreneurs, on the visioning and executioning, but also leveraging the DNA, putting the DNA biology at the center. Not dissimilar from what you're doing. And in fact, I think DNA could be a great add-on to step one of your program for athletes, and we can definitely talk about how to potentially do that. Make it easier for you to empower your folks.
Yeah, we have a ton of entrepreneurs in our program as well. I'd love to hear a little bit more about when you say what you're doing with entrepreneurs in terms of combining their vision with a specific timeline with periodization. Could you explain a little bit more about what that kind of looks like? That sounds very interesting.
Yeah. That's, it's funny. It's like, who am I becoming, right? It's what we were talking about is so, as a, let's say, academic, then, athlete, and then entrepreneur. One of the things that I noticed was I wasn't really following a process, or I was making it up as you go along. And I think as entrepreneurs, we do that because we're definitely not 9-to-5ers, right? We do what is necessary, but then there becomes a certain point where you need to do what is necessary, but you need to do in a way that is sustainable. So, I ran into issue with burnout. I've worked with a lot of athletes and entrepreneurs have run into an issue with burnout, and essentially what I found is the biology and the psychology are not lined up. And so what I do is I get a planning tool that I built that I call this whole thing the IRIS operating system. So a better way to see yourself from the inside out, starting with your biology, then with the psychology. It's like, well, who do you want to be in 3 years? I like that time. It just seems to be the right number, because people tend to underestimate what they can do in 3 years and overestimate what they can do in 1. In 10 years, forget it. You'll never do it. So I help people craft what that vision is of themselves and really vividly see it. And I say this, and for the right person listening, they're gonna be like, yeah, I need that. I actually just had lunch with an architect today where his job is to build the vision and plan, and I'm like, so all you do is plan? He's like, yeah, my doing is actually planning, right? Because a lot of times people do all the planning. It's like, well, where does the rubber hit the road, and where's all the action? And entrepreneurs are very action oriented. So what I do is I hold the space for that visioning and planning, and then I bring in the human performance periodization principles, right? So you would know this as kind of your top down, bottom up, macro cycle, micro cycle. Well, you can break everything down in terms of well, how much capital do you want to raise, and when do you want to exit your business, and when do you want to launch your product, and when do you need to let go certain members of your team, and how do you grow and adapt and form the right partnerships. And so really starting to roadmap all of that stuff is what I've been doing with entrepreneurs, where their Olympic Games is, potentially that exit or that IPO.
I love that analogy. Yeah, our number one program is something called SuperAthlete Training Camp, where it's what would your life look like if you were, I recently used the example of Francis Ngannou getting ready for his, boxing fight, 12 weeks.
Yeah.
Yes, you probably do not have a championship boxing fight 12 weeks from now, but just like you said, you do have something that's really important to you.
Yeah.
So what are you doing to completely dial it in? One of the themes that we consistently talk about here is our physiology drives our psychology. So
100%.
how we're taking care of our body is going to determine our mind. And then you use kind of a different frame of our biology and our psychology can maybe not be aligned. Could you possibly talk about what you kind of mean by that in terms of, and then maybe what are some things people can do to get those two things in alignment?
Yeah, I mean, so I think certainly there may be some like underlying biological reason why one's psychology might be off. You know, for example, the THFR gene is a great example where, you know, I still wasn't quite getting my kind of mindset dialed in. There's this kind of like underlying background angst, and you know, I thought I had my system somewhat optimized, but when I revisited my genetics, I'm like, oh, actually, you know, integrating this supplementation plan, you know, more of a parasympathetic focus, again, putting that S-adenosine methionine in, and so that was really a biology issue. It wasn't that, you know, I was focused on how I failed before and how I'm not good enough. Like I didn't have like a mind virus that I was looped into, but I still wasn't feeling right. So sometimes those things can be off. But I think, you know, once you've got the basics, you know, of your biology in place, and then by the way, that's like a whole constant and never-ending improvement mechanism that I like to really sync with, to the extent that we can, a circadian rhythm. So like look at like natural points of the day where cognition is up and do important work there. If you can do it, here's where the best time is to do your physical work. So it's really mapping your activities onto natural, you know, circadian rhythms. And so that's a way to just start to feel a better fit biologically with your psychological action.
Can I pause real quick there?
Yeah.
Did you ever hear about that book, The Power of When?
The Power of When. I've heard of it. I haven't read it. Yeah, but that's exactly my point.
So
yes.
okay, so my question is, the premise of the book is that there's bears, which kind of the whole world's base timing is where they're best, like 10 to 7. There's lions who are, most entrepreneurs are lions, you know, type A, get up early. There's wolves who are, you know, they do best kind of at night. And then there's the dolphins in terms of they don't really sleep too much, like, because going back to evolution, they always had to have kind of one eye open to kind of help guard the tribe. But my question was, do you have any? Is that genetic, or is that in terms of, is that actually in the genome? I don't know if you're familiar with it, but in terms of our circadian rhythm, is that actually in our genes that determines? Go ahead.
Yeah, we can look at predispositions to be any of those things. So like, you know, a night owl and a morning bird. But I mean, remember, like your genetics is not, your DNA is not destiny, so to speak. So if I'm unconscious of this predisposition, I may be wondering why I feel like I get this so-called second wind at the end of the day, and why I'm such a slow starter in the morning. And you know, that is me. I am on the side of the night owl versus the morning bird. But I've changed my behaviors because for me it makes more sense to do those activities in the day. So there are times where, if done well, you can overcome your genetics, right? And that's actually really what a big part of knowing your DNA is knowing your DNA well enough so that you can consciously choose the environment that will bring about the authentic expression of yourself, you know, in the form that you see yourself, in that vision. So, but to answer the question again, the psychology and biology, there's, you know, a ton of psychology that needs to be done around, you know, your vision of yourself. And I don't just mean your goal of, you know, the $50 million exit or the $1 billion net worth. It's like, that's great, got to have the results, but what about the relationships? What about the different roles and personalities that make you up that you need to integrate so that you can behave with integrity, so that when, you know, your friends look at you, it's not surprising how you show up at work, right? And your colleagues see you, they're not surprised by your friends, and you know, your partner's on board with what you're doing, and you know, there's a level of service in the community that's an actual extension of what you do in your work and your career. So it's amazing how little people get a chance to kind of just talk through what they actually think. So I spend a lot of time helping entrepreneurs get clear, not just on what they're going to hit in 3 years, but to set them up for heights higher than that. So in as much as I say, well, nobody says a 10-year goal. When we reassess in 3 years, we're like, wow, okay, well, we actually achieved in 3 years, in 1.5 years, and so when I think about my life plan, I have this whole new trajectory. And so I think it comes back to getting the right principles at the center of the psychology. And you know what? Ray Dalio wrote a great book on this called Principles. So he essentially failed hard, and he realized he failed hard because he didn't have a compass. And so, we talked about the DNA compass. That's something that I help entrepreneurs define, and I help them define their compass in terms of their principles, their values, and their personal mission.
I really like that because it's really really breaks down. It sounds like the different specific roles that really make up a good life, and it's not what's communicated in the media, and in terms of just focusing on particular outcomes with business and or success. So we have a lot of entrepreneurs who listen to this show who it's hard getting them to do anything else beside work.
Mm.
Could you maybe share your specific thoughts on why you feel it's important that these different specific roles in their lives are beneficial to them in the long term and also can potentially be beneficial to their business?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can sure try. I don't, whether it comes through or not. Yeah, we'll see how many people reach out to you. So, I mean, I've got this notion that you really, I don't think you can be first rate at your work if your work is all that you are, right? So, I mean, think of it this way. It's like if I'm a hockey player and all I do is on ice training and on ice drills, and I'm a really good shooter and I have the best shot in the league, but I don't study the game. I don't take a step back to study the game and do what Wayne Gretzky did, which was skate to where the puck's going to be. Right? If my teammates don't like me, they're not going to pass me the puck, as strange as that is. Right? So you can think about a performance analogy there, where it's like, well, your job is to shoot and score, which a lot of entrepreneurs it is. But there's this whole notion of, well, if you want to go fast, go by yourself. If you want to go far, go together. And if you're going to go far, if you want to go together, then you're going to have to invest in relationships. In relationships, like, people are not things, right? So developing communication skills requires that you communicate with a diversity of people in the work setting, outside of the work setting. Like, if you can talk to a child, you can be much more empathetic and give any person much more grace as a result of their imperfections. And, look, I know folks like Steve Jobs were, cutthroat and zero tolerance in terms of, how he would drive his business ahead. But it's like, and he did a lot of great things, but you know what? He also died of cancer really young. I wonder how much that had to do with the lack of balance. Well, then there's that. I mean, again, it is, yeah, it really does. Well, you said something really important. You said, well, like, what if you had to put everything on the line? There's this thing that you wanted to perform at for 12 weeks. Okay, what if, okay, instead of we're building your 3-year goal vision, which is all fine and good and fun, and everybody loves kind of their vision board, but it's like, what if you're dead in 3 years, right? What if you're dead in 3 years and you've got some people who are going to talk on your behalf at your funeral, your eulogy, you're going to give your eulogy. Who is the most important person to you in their life, and what are they going to say about you, right? What might your colleagues say? What might your friends say? What might somebody in your community say about the service that you were able to give? And, unless you're a sociopath, like, most people are going to want people to say nice things about them. And they're going to be concerned about the work they did in this lifetime, perpetuating and providing fruits in perpetuity in the future. So, the acorns that you plant today become the oaks of tomorrow. And I think when, push comes to shove, entrepreneurs know that. Oftentimes it's, well, like Mike Tyson said, everybody's got a plan until they got punched in the face. And once you get punched in the face as an entrepreneur, that's when you're like, okay, I can do this better, right? And the punch in the face might be a lost relationship with somebody you really care about. It might be a coup, from your team. It might be, that you've got a toxic investor on your board. Well, how did those things get to that point? It's probably really where the entrepreneur gets empowered is saying, okay, well, what aspect of this can I take responsibility for? And then you start to grow that autonomy and expand your circle of influence, so to say. And that's a really exciting thing, because what you're doing is you're opening yourself up to synergy, this whole idea of 1 + 1 = 3. And I think that's the selling point there to entrepreneurs, is like, again, it comes back, if you want to go far, go together, and you don't even know how great you could be with the right people around you.
Yeah, I forgot where I heard the quote from, but in terms of entrepreneur, it was you are your company's biggest asset, who you are as a person.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's really relevant to what you're saying. Quick sidetrack here, because you mentioned the word sociopath. So underlying theme of that has actually been a pretty consistent topic in the past year on this show has been psychology, and how our different personality traits impact performance. Really quick, when you were at Athletigen, was it just physical genetics that you were looking at, or was it stuff that you guys did in terms of mental as well that impacted how these coaches communicated with athletes?
Yeah, that's a real good question. Short answer is the focus was predominantly physical, but I will share some preliminary results that we had. I guess you could call it around cognition, and more specifically how that related to music choice. So we had a partnership with Skull Candy, and we did some research on athletes in terms of what kind of music they like to listen to in terms of preparation for competition. And what we found was athletes. So there's a gene. It's the COMP3 gene, I think is what it is. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure. Yeah, I don't have it in front of me, but let's just say it was your COMP3 gene. And anyway, it's the warrior gene. No, just call it COMT. So COMT. And depending on which combination of alleles you had, you might prefer some. So if you're a worrier, what we found is athletes who tend to be worriers, they like to listen to classical music on the day, like bring it down, Whereas if athletes were like warriors, they're like, give me the bass, like this is going to pump me up, right? So, very like preliminary, I'd say at the point of evidence-based. I wouldn't say, ascribe your DNA to your music selection at this point, but, certainly, yeah, it's like the psychology. Well, of course, it's going to affect your predisposition for performance, but
it's really interesting you brought up warrior. I just read a book that had a focus on that in terms of performance and how we respond to stress. So if I understand correctly, the warrior actually does better when they're under stress. I think it was a little bit counterintuitive. I think it was the warrior because they, one of those two does well with deadlines, with stress, automatically under pressure, while the other one not as well. So that seems like that would be potentially good to know in terms of performance and performance psychology, in terms of how to interpret stressful situations and things like that. I don't know how much you know about those two, but
I
I want to
think
say it was the warrior.
No, I think you're on to it. I think that I lost you a little bit there, but I think I got the gist of what you were saying. So, yeah, in terms of the worrier, they don't need a lot of stress to bring intensity to the situation, right? Um, right. And then that's like a really, you're probably not looking at an analytical player. You're probably looking at a QB. You're probably looking at a pitcher. You're like, that's where a goalie, for example. Um, it's like you might say they create their own stress, but let's not go that far. The other side of it is there's the warrior, which are like, you've seen them. They're these athletes who they don't seem to do any training. They're kind of middle of the pack on the training. Then race day comes, and like, how did you pull that out? It's like they needed that extra stress to bring it. Let's just say. Um, and then, yeah, that I think knowing that about your athlete, you can imagine. Well, that's gonna affect the vernacular that the coach uses to bring out the best in them.
Okay, I want to kind of go back and forth on a couple things as we wrap this up here. In terms of,
Sure.
you said that with looking at the entire genome now, that it changes it consistently updates. What is it updating and what is it looking at?
Right. So when we talk about if you were to sequence your whole genome with sequencing.com, and then you would get these weekly updates. Yeah. So the advances in genome DNA research are just insane. In terms of, maybe there were like a few papers a week that were published, 20 years ago. Now it's like thousands a week. And so sequencing.com has basically access to the public database where those discoveries are being published. And then, if you have your DNA with sequencing.com, then you essentially get all the updates from the literature, right? So, take, for example, the sprint gene. We didn't always know about the sprint gene. Like, let's say I can't remember the exact date. Let's just say 2010. We didn't know what the sprint gene was. And then lo and behold, it came online because, we had researchers do the great work. And so we have, thousands, tens of thousands of researchers studying the genome every day and publishing that information to the public domain. And so you can access that information in real time with weekly updates from sequencing.com.
Wow, that's super helpful. That's interesting. Thousands of papers a week.
Yeah,
that's crazy.
Easily. Yeah.
And then, in terms of, I'd love to hear, what do you think 10, 20, 30 years from now? Do you have a positive view, negative view, kind of cynical view in terms of how all of this is going to impact athletic performance and things like that, in terms of gene altering and things like that? Do you have any specific take on it? Do you feel like that's overblown? I read a book on CRISPR last year, and it seemed like it was doing a lot more positive than negative. It seems like the negative stuff is what the fear-mongering is what gets attention in the media. But do you have any specific thoughts on how this is going to impact high-level athletics?
Yeah. I mean, given that AI is on the scene now, it's like I got to do a reset on my outlook. And I mean, here's what I'm just testing this idea by saying it out loud. I don't know if it's fully true or not. But what I've been saying to myself is anything that you can imagine in terms of, directing where human evolution could go could be figured out by 2030, let's say. And so, look, I mean, I think what we're talking about inadvertently when we talk about athletes, we're talking about the genetically modified athlete. And actually, interestingly, I was on a panel in South by Southwest years ago on this topic, of like gene doping, let's say. So yeah, I mean, I think gene doping will be a thing, if it isn't already. And But more than that, it's again, this is where the morals and ethics needs to be at the center. Who are we choosing to be as a species, right? So, like, that's what I mean, right? Is where, look, like, Homo sapiens weren't always Homo sapiens, or they weren't Homo sapiens in isolation. We coexisted with Neanderthals, and before that, we had a common ancestor. So, what new species are we becoming, and might we want to become? So that's a really interesting change in the dialogue. And look, we've done genetic modification to plants. Like, we can put salmon. Is it salmon? No, eel. Well, yeah, you can put eel growth hormone in salmon and grow them at crazy speeds. You can put it's another fish gene. It's like an antifreeze gene in strawberries, and they avoid the frost. It's like, hey, are we going to put photosynthetic genes in humans? And those are the ones that are going to go on Elon Musk's rocket ships to Mars, because now they're going to be able to fix carbon and photosynthesize their own food sources. I know it's far out there, but I think our definition of who we're becoming is going to be a topic of lively conversation in the immediate future. So, like I say, before 2030. So, okay, say that it doesn't move that fast. We can go back to things like technologies like, gene therapy. Yeah, that's going to be more perfected. Probably going to see that more on like the longevity markets to start. And again, this is more kind of probably starting with aesthetic, but in the spirit of disease as well, right? Like CRISPR-Cas9 and gene editing is essentially what we're talking about. It's a fascinating time, and again, my prediction is we're going to be in a position to choose what we want our species to look like 100 years from now, and actually make that happen. Yeah.
I think that's a great way to wrap up, because it kind of goes back to the central theme of this conversation of folks, and it's about who we want to be,
who we want to be,
rather than the outcome. I'd love to do a couple rapid fire questions with you, Jeremy.
Sure.
Biggest mentor in your life?
Yeah, I got to say my coach, Garnet Cross, coach of 10 years. I mean, he's the reason why I reserve time to coach a select few. He helped me see myself, and he helped me answer that question around who I want to become. And he passed 2 years ago, and yeah, the most incredible mind I ever had a chance to spend time with, Garnet Cross. Yeah. Mm.
And then best book or research paper that you've read in the past year?
Best book in the past year. Oh man, I'm just looking at my bookshelf. Well, I'll tell you the one I got open right now is The Structure of Evolutionary Theory by Stephen Jay Gould. He's an evolutionary biologist, Harvard guy. What I love about so this book that he wrote he would say is the book that Darwin would have written if he had more time. So he really expands out evolutionary theory. But one of the things that I love about Stephen Jay Gould's writing, one of the things that he said is getting to the irreducible essence of our biology. It's the variation that exists, and that's the richness of life. And so finding out where you are on this variation, I think, is the key to actualizing your goals.
Interesting. I just put it in my cart. That sounds really good. Best habit that you have added or subtracted from your life in the past year that you feel has like added the most value?
Man, I gotta say, so I minored in philosophy, so that's a warning statement. And I went hardcore, obviously, down the genetics route, but I've rediscovered the philosophy, and so the new habit is reading from the great books every morning. And I'm currently I would say 3/4 of the way through the Old Testament and the New Testament coming, and then onto the Greek tragedies, and hopefully through around there's 102 great human ideas, and my goal is to get through them all in my lifetime.
Wow, that's so inspiring.
Oh, thank you.
Dr. Jeremy Koenig, you killed it today, Super Athlete Radio. Best place for people to reach out to you, and then more about what you're doing if they want to connect with your personal services and or sequencing.com.
Yeah. So I have my site's live, although it's not very informative. It's drjeremykoenig.com. My email is jeremy@irisinfinity. You can catch me there. If entrepreneurs are interested in coaching, that's jeremy@irisinfinity.com. If people are interested in exploring their genomes, that's sequencing.com. And you can reach me there at jeremy@sequencing.com.
Jeremy, thank you so much for coming on Super Athlete Radio today, and I look forward to meeting you in person and have you come on again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chase. It was a pleasure and an honor to be here.